Hi everyone, I'm Jennifer Bashford. I'm one of the distant students from Phoenix, Arizona. And I'll give a brief intro since this is my second semester of the MAG program here at USC. I also did a semester at UNC back in North Carolina before we moved out here. I also have a master's degree in communications and am currently simultaneously working on a graduate certificate in animal assisted therapy. And I work at a local nursing home in activities with our certified therapy dogs. So if you hear any dog barking, I apologize. There are four of them, so it's kind of hard to get them to stop. Anyway, my article was entitled Family Caregiving to Those with Dementia in Rural Alabama, Racial Similarities and Differences. It's from the Journal of Aging Health and was written in 2007, so a fairly recent article. One sentence summary is after surveying caregivers in rural Alabama, the authors found that there were differences in caregiver burden, stress, quality of life, and coping mechanisms between white and African American caregivers. This article was personally interesting to me because I grew up in rural Alabama, if you couldn't tell from my accent, and so reading it was very interesting because I can testify to the remoteness and the lack of resources in the counties in Alabama. And actually, the vast majority of counties in Alabama are considered rural according to the U.S. Census. It's like 43 out of 51 are rural in Alabama, which is pretty significant and is probably also the case in a lot of southern states. So while this article focuses on Alabama, it's actually very applicable to rural areas in the South as well as across the country. The survey was conducted with random dial phone interviews. They ended up selecting 141 participants. They were all paid $50 for an hour structured interview. They used a number of quantitative instruments that have all been well established. The short portable mental status questionnaire, the interpersonal support evaluation list, the Duke Religious Index, the COPE scale, and the consequences of care index. They also used to evaluate the care recipients, they also used the dementia severity rating scale to make sure that everyone, the 141 participants were all about the same in terms of level of dementia. The caregivers surveyed, the 141, they ranged from 22 to 82 years old, but the average was about 52. They were primarily women, vast majority. They were primarily Protestant, and they primarily worked full-time, as well as caregiving. They were also evenly split between non-Hispanic whites and African American caregivers. The average caregiver provided approximately 50 hours of face-to-face care each week, which on top of working an average of 37 hours a week. So it's a pretty significant burden of care for these caregivers. The research showed that African American caregivers relied primarily on religion, formalized religion, going to church, participating in Bible study, very structured activities, and denial as a way of coping with the burden of caregiving. They also perceived caregiving to be much less of a stress or a burden on their lives. They perceived themselves and their care recipients to be less depressed, and they felt it was more of their duty. The white caregivers tended to use acceptance and humor as a way to cope with the caregiving burden. They were more likely to attribute depression to themselves and to their care recipients, and they were equally religious internally, but they were significantly less likely to participate in formal religious activities. And they experienced significantly more stress, negative effects on their lives. They perceived their care recipients to be much more of a burden, and the caregiving itself to be much more of a burden. The other interesting thing is that the almost a fifth, or actually almost a quarter of these caregivers also cared for a second individual. They did not collect much data on this second care recipient, but they were giving on average 30 hours a week towards another individual ranging from age 12 to 90. So not necessarily small children, but other family members, whether it was the spouse of the original care recipient or not. African American care recipients tended to be other family members, whereas white care recipients tended to be adult parents. And that's something that's pretty interesting. They did not touch on it a lot in the article. They didn't kind of go into the details, but the fact that caregiving is perceived to be more of a community effort in the African American community in these rural areas. Whether it's because younger family members have moved away, so the actual child of the adult parents is not caring for them, but for whatever reason, the majority of African American care recipients were being cared for by someone other than their child or their spouse. The white caregivers tended to have higher incomes, and the African American caregivers tended to report more difficulty in paying bills, which is also interesting because you would think with the financial difficulty, they would report more burden in this caregiving, but they didn't. It was the opposite. The white caregivers had more financial security, yet reported more burden emotionally. So something that is interesting that might be an additional avenue to look at. The article is very well written. It's very clear. They provide detailed data, lots of statistics for those of us who are statistic nerds. Previously well-established scales, so they weren't coming up with new things and testing them. These are all scales that have been proven over time. I would have liked to have seen a copy of all the scales in the addendum, so that it would be helpful to have a copy of all of these 5 scales that they use to review exactly what they were asking. The major limitation of their argument is the absence of a theoretical framework. They do the research, they present the data, they present the conclusions. They don't provide any form of theoretical framework to look at the data, which would be helpful in terms of giving it some context. For example, exchange theory would be interesting, how the different communities, racial, rural versus urban, there's a lot of different ways that you could look at exchange theory, perhaps looking at it in the course of successful aging as these caregivers grow older. There's a lot of different ways that they could have brought in some theory that I think it would have helped provide some context. It relates to the topics and themes of this week's readings. In a way, the individuals studied in this rural study most likely are already qualified for Medicaid and always have been. So it's not an issue of them spending down their assets. Even the well-off white care recipients are still right on the border, right on the poverty line. We're still talking under $40,000 for a household. So that doesn't really apply, as well as that there is a lack of resources available. Some of these rural areas are so remote that they might be able to use Medicaid to get into a nursing home. There's just not a nursing home within 100 miles, or there aren't paid home health care workers available. So it's hard to say whether these individuals would be using those resources if they were available. Are they relying on family care members because that's their preference, or is it because there aren't any other options? So that this is kind of a logical opportunity for in the discussion of paying family members to care for relatives. The book obviously had a lot of discussion on this. Older caregivers tend to be less likely to want the money. They see it more as their duty as opposed to a burden. Most of the caregivers in this study are older, so I think they would probably fall under that, seeing it as their duty as opposed to wanting to receive money for it. But that's an interesting thing that could be discussed later. The study limitations, the authors clearly state their limitations. This was kind of a primary study in an otherwise unresearched area. So it's a latitudinal study, so it kind of limits the scale of cumulative knowledge over time. They would like to have a larger study so that they could bring in some quantitative and some qualitative information. They need more men. There aren't very many men either doing caregiving in these areas or not responding, or so there's more study is needed to figure out that aspect of it. Um, Much more data is needed around the secondary care recipient, if how that affects people's sense of burden if they have a secondary care recipient, and how much care they're actually giving to this secondary care recipient. And then, like I mentioned, the establishing the relationship between are they choosing family care because they choose it, or are they choosing family care because there are no other options? And that's a big aspect right there. Plus, they don't mention it, but the study limitation, no theory. It's one of the only sources of data on rural caregiving because most studies tend to be done near a university or near a research center, so they tend to be more urban areas. So this is an interesting study looking at the difference in rural areas. I was surprised. I did not realize that religion would play such an aspect in caregiver experience, both formally going to church, participating in activities, and informally having internal sense of religion and internal prayer or Bible study. So that was something that was interesting to me. And in terms of changes to public policy, not really any changes of public policy. I do think it is a reminder to policymakers that the elderly in rural and urban areas are different. And they have different needs, they have different resources available. It's not as simple as just looking at Medicaid and saying, okay, all nursing homes get this, or all home health care workers get this. There are the resources available. And I think it is something to look at the possibility of whether it's providing roaming home health care centers, where educational centers where family can go and get more care, get more information so they can better provide for their family members, or providing a traveling nurse that can go around and help out with some of these people that are at home without the education or without the resources they may need to take care of their loved ones. So there are definitely some options. I think this article is an excellent starting point for a lot of questions that need to be asked in society in terms of rural care recipients and rural caregivers. Thank you very much.